Somehow America has been conditioned to believe that we get to decide what struggles matter. Who's poor enough? Who's hungry enough? Who deserves grace or the benefit of the doubt? Where does empathy end and judgment begin? I mean, surely our humanity wouldn't allow us to mistreat the least of us, right? Right? Or is the issue much more complicated? Today we'll look into history, psychology, and politics to determine why we've become a country more hell-bent on deciding who deserves relief from suffering, rather than asking why preventable suffering has become something people must earn their way out of. Where do those ideas originate, and why? Why should a hungry child who is well-dressed not be looked at as hungry? Why should immigration status determine which children eat? Why does the aesthetic of poor have to be met for empathy to activate? Because apparently being in need isn't always enough. We need to know the backstory first. How did you get here? Did you make good choices? Did you work hard enough? Did you follow the rules? Could you have prevented this? And my personal favorite, have you done absolutely everything humanly possible to fix it yourself before asking anyone else for help? And listen, some of those questions can matter. We have limited resources. Government programs have eligibility requirements. Responsibility doesn't suddenly stop existing because someone needs help. But pay attention to what happens when those questions become the first thing we ask. We stop measuring the need. We start measuring the person. Now it's not just, are you hungry? It's, why are you hungry? Not just, do you need help? But, what did you do to end up needing help? And depending on how we feel about the answer, the exact same need can suddenly deserve a completely different response. That's the part that gets me. Because a hungry child with nice shoes is still hungry. A person sleeping outside still needs somewhere safe to sleep. A person who can't afford their medication is still sick. Nothing about the actual need changed. We did. We decided one story deserved more empathy than another. And we've gotten really good at creating categories for it. Deserving and undeserving, hardworking and lazy, innocent and responsible, victim and consequence. But who made those categories? And maybe even more importantly, who taught us what belongs inside of them? Because I don't think this conversation is as simple as everybody deserves everything. Of course it isn't. That would make this episode about 6 minutes long and honestly, kind of boring. I want to know why two people can experience the same hardship, and we can look at one with compassion and the other with judgment. I want to know why they made bad choices can sometimes end a conversation about suffering. I want to know why we care so much about whether somebody earned our empathy in the first place. And I really want to know how those judgments made their way out of our heads and into our hearts and politics. Because once we start building policy around who we think is deserving, these aren't just personal opinions anymore. They determine who qualifies, who's excluded, who's punished, who gets another chance, who actually gets to eat, and who gets told, you did this to yourself. So maybe the question isn't just who deserves what. Maybe we need to ask, who taught us what a deserving person looks like? And what happens when they don't look the way we expected? Welcome to You Oughta Know Betta. I'm AJ. You might know me as Unicorn. And this is the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Around here, I'm not interested in telling you what political opinion you're supposed to have. I'm interested in what's underneath it. Where did the idea come from? What does this history tell us? What is our brain doing with that information? And what happens when all of that becomes politics and policy? You can agree with me. You can disagree with me. Hell, you might change your mind. Just come curious and bring your receipts. Because the goal isn't to think the same. It's to think deeper, know better, do better, be better. Let's get into it. Now, before you say I'm calling you cold and heartless, I'm not. As a matter of fact, I'm not talking directly to you at all. But if the shoe fits, then maybe this episode is for you. Your brain is wired to ask why. It's literally designed to make things make sense. However, why shouldn't automatically end in judgment. When I was a girl, my mother would tell me, "Baby, what you give a person is not for you to dictate. You've done your part. What they do with it is between them and God." In other words, I didn't need to create a narrative in my spirit just to be good to someone. The need was still there, no matter how I felt about the person who had it. But somewhere along the way, we started believing that doing good has to be justified. That before empathy kicks in, we need an explanation. How did this happen? Who caused it? Could they have prevented it? And most importantly, is this somehow their fault? Psychology actually gives us a way to understand why our minds go looking for those answers. Fritz Heider, an Austrian psychologist, laid the foundation for what we now call attribution theory. The idea that when we observe behavior or circumstances, we naturally try to figure out what caused them. Was it something about the person, their choices, or their character? Or was it something about the situation they were in? And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Understanding why something happened can help us figure out what happens next. The problem comes when understanding the cause turns into deciding the person's worth. When "how did you get here" becomes "so you did this to yourself." When skepticism stops helping us understand someone's circumstances and starts overriding our humanity. Because no matter what story we create about how someone ended up hungry, they're still hungry. But attribution only explains part of this. Because sometimes figuring out why something happened isn't just about understanding them. Sometimes it's about protecting the way we understand the world. A psychologist by the name of Melvin Lerner spent years studying what became known as the just world hypothesis. Our tendency to want to believe that the world is, at least to some degree, predictable and fair. That people's actions have consequences. That good choices generally lead somewhere good, and bad choices generally lead somewhere bad. And honestly, I understand why our brains would want that. Because the alternative is terrifying, honestly. Terrible things can happen to people who did everything right. Then terrible things can happen to me, even if I do everything right. If being unhoused can happen without laziness, addiction, or irresponsibility, then having a job and making good decisions doesn't make me completely safe from homelessness. If poverty can happen to someone who worked hard, then hard work isn't a guarantee against poverty. That's uncomfortable. So sometimes finding fault in another person's circumstances gives us something their suffering took away from us. A sense of control. If I can figure out what they did wrong, I can tell myself what I need to do differently. And this is where a search for explanation can get ugly. Because instead of allowing someone's suffering to challenge our belief that the world is fair, we can start adjusting our opinion of the person who is suffering. Maybe they didn't try hard enough. Maybe they were irresponsible. Maybe there's something they're not telling us. Or maybe they deserve some of what happened. Now we're getting dangerously close to another question. What does an undeserving person look like? Because be honest, when I say homeless person, an image probably comes to mind. When I say welfare recipient, something may come to mind. When I say criminal, something may come to mind. And you didn't consciously sit down one afternoon and design those people. Your brain built categories. This is where prototype theory becomes useful. When we think about categories, we don't necessarily store a checklist containing every possible person who could belong to one. We can develop a mental representation of what a typical member of that category looks like. A prototype. Think about the word bird. A robin probably fits the category in your head more easily than a penguin. They're both birds, but one looks more like what many of us imagine when somebody says bird. Now take that same mental process and put it somewhere much more consequential. What does poverty look like? Is it someone sleeping under an overpass? Or is it a mother wearing clean clothes, carrying an iPhone, who has $12 left until payday? What does hunger look like? Does the child have to be visibly thin? Do their clothes have to be dirty? Does their refrigerator have to be completely empty? What does a criminal look like? Because now our prototypes aren't sorting birds, they're sorting people. And those mental pictures didn't develop in a vacuum. No. Politics, media, history, entertainment, personal experience, and the stories repeated around us can all contribute to which examples become most available when we think about a group. America has created some incredibly powerful ones. The welfare queen, the dangerous thug, the lazy homeless person, the hardened criminal. These aren't neutral descriptions of entire populations. They're stories. And once a story becomes recognizable enough, we can start looking for evidence that a real person fits it. That's where the aesthetic of poor starts to matter. Someone tells you they're struggling financially, but they have a newer phone. Something feels off. Someone receives food assistance, but their child has nice shoes. Wait a minute. Someone says they're homeless, but they're clean and well dressed. Are they really homeless? Notice what we're doing? We're comparing an actual human being against the prototype in our head. And if they don't look enough like our mental picture of suffering, we can start questioning whether the suffering is real. But poverty doesn't have a uniform. Neither does hunger, homelessness, innocence, or guilt. The danger isn't simply that we have prototypes. Categorization is part of how the brain organizes an impossibly complicated world. The danger comes when the prototype becomes the standard a human being has to match before we believe them. Because now, empathy has an entrance exam. You have to look poor enough, act grateful enough, have made few enough mistakes. Your suffering has to make sense to us. And if it doesn't, we don't necessarily question the category. Sometimes we question you. And that's where psychology starts becoming something much bigger than psychology. Because America didn't just imagine categories of deserving and undeserving people. Eventually, we started building policy around them. So where did we get these ideas? Because America didn't invent the idea that some poor people deserve help and others don't. We inherited a lot of it. Long before the United States existed, English poor relief laws were already separating people in need into categories. There were people who couldn't work because they were sick, elderly, disabled, or children. Then there were able-bodied people who were expected to work. And that mattered. Because poverty wasn't treated as one condition with one response. who you were, why you were poor, whether you could work, and what authorities thought about your circumstances could determine what happened to you. Sound familiar? When English colonists came to North America, those ideas came with them. Early American communities often handled poverty locally, and getting assistance could mean more than proving that you needed something. Local officials could investigate your circumstances, decide whether you belong to that community, determine whether relatives should support you, place people into poorhouses, or require work in exchange for relief. So think about what happened historically. We didn't simply build systems that asked, is this person in need? We built systems that also asked, why? Psychology gave us the instinct to assign responsibility. History gave that instinct paperwork. And by the 20th century, America was building a much larger social welfare system. The Great Depression changed the conversation because suddenly millions of Americans were struggling at the same time. And it's much harder to explain poverty entirely through individual failure when unemployment and economic collapse are happening on that scale. The New Deal dramatically expanded the federal government role in economic security. But even then, America didn't create one giant program called People Need Help. We created different programs for different kinds of needs. And those programs didn't all develop the same political meaning. Social Security is a great example. Workers contribute through payroll taxes, and eligibility for retirement benefits is tied to a person's work history. That created a powerful story around the program. I earned this. Listen to the language people still use. I paid into Social Security. That's my money. I worked for that. Receiving the benefit doesn't necessarily threaten someone's identity as independent or hardworking, because the benefit itself is connected to contribution. Now compare that with the way America has talked about some means-tested assistance programs. Suddenly the language changes. Handout, dependency, living off the government, taxpayer money. And I want to stop here because this distinction is extremely important. I'm not saying Social Security and cash welfare are the same program. They're not. They have different structures, purposes, eligibility rules, and funding mechanisms. I'm asking why receiving money from government can tell us two completely different stories about someone's character. One recipient becomes someone receiving what they earned, and another becomes someone receiving what they didn't. And once again, we're measuring the person. But we can't talk honestly about American welfare politics without talking about race. Because over time, the image of welfare and American politics became heavily racialized. And one of the most powerful examples is the welfare queen. The phrase became specifically associated with Ronald Reagan's political rhetoric in the 1970s and 80s. Reagan repeatedly told stories about welfare fraud, including a Chicago woman who he said used multiple identities to collect large amounts of government benefits. There was a real woman behind the most famous version of that story, Linda Taylor, who was investigated and convicted of welfare fraud. But politically, the story became much bigger than one person committing fraud. The welfare queen became a character, a woman abusing the system, taking taxpayer money, refusing responsibility, getting something that she had not earned. And although Reagan didn't always explicitly identify the woman in his speeches as black, the stereotype became strongly associated in American political culture with black women. Now go back to what we just talked about with prototypes, because this is how psychology and history start talking to each other. Once a particular image becomes associated with welfare, you don't have to know anything about the millions of individuals receiving assistance. You already have a character available in your head. And that character can start standing in for an entire system. It's powerful politically because now we're no longer debating only, does this program reduce policy? We're also debating, are people taking advantage of us? And those are very different emotional questions. But here's where I want to make this conversation uncomfortable in another direction. Government assistance is everywhere in America. We subsidize agriculture. We provide benefits to veterans. We subsidize certain housing costs through the tax code. We provide assistance to businesses. We provide Social Security and Medicare. During economic tough times, governments have stepped in to stabilize industries, employers, homeowners, workers, and even banks. But we don't describe every person or business receiving government support as being on welfare. Why? Part of the answer is obvious. These programs aren't identical. But that can't be the end of the conversation, because the words we choose tell us something about how we understand the recipient. A benefit, an investment, an incentive, a subsidy, a bailout, an entitlement, relief, a handout. Those words don't feel the same. They carry judgments about contribution, responsibility, legitimacy, and deservingness. And sometimes the difference between assistance and dependency isn't simply that government providing something for someone. It's the story we've attached to who receives it. Which brings us right back to that hungry child. Because once a society starts separating people into categories of deserving and undeserving, those categories don't stay in speeches. They don't stay in stereotypes. Eventually, somebody has to decide who actually qualifies. Somebody writes the eligibility requirement. Somebody decides which income counts, whether employment matters, whether family structure matters, immigration status. Have you contributed enough? Did you wait long enough? Did you prove it? And now the question, who deserves what, isn't philosophical anymore. It's policy. America didn't just develop opinions about deservingness. We built systems capable of enforcing them. And that's where we need to go next. So now we've made it to politics. And this is where who deserves what stops being something we debate at the dinner table and starts having actual consequences. Because government has to make choices. There is no government program where the eligibility requirement is simply, you need something, cool, here you go. There are rules, there are limits, there are qualifications, and honestly, there have to be. Government isn't responsible for public money. Resources are not unlimited. Programs are created for specific purposes, and somebody has to decide who qualifies. I don't think the existence of eligibility requirements is necessarily the problem. I think the more interesting question is, what are we measuring when we decide who qualifies? Income, age, disability, employment, family size, immigration status, work history. How much have you contributed? Whether they are even actively looking for work at that time. Every one of those requirements represents a decision about what we believe should matter. Take work requirements. On the surface, the argument makes sense. If someone is physically capable of working and receives government assistance, should we expect them to work or at least make an effort to find work? Not an unreasonable question. But neither is this one. If someone cannot find qualifying work, doesn't have reliable transportation, is caring for someone else, lives somewhere without enough jobs, or is working but still doesn't earn enough to survive, what exactly are we measuring? Need? Or whether they've demonstrated enough effort for us to feel comfortable meeting that need. Remember what we talked about earlier: control, responsibility, reciprocity. need. The psychology didn't disappear when we got to politics. We just gave it an application form. And then there's immigration. I asked you earlier why immigration status should determine which children eat. That question gets complicated really fast because immigration status is legally relevant. Countries have borders. Citizenship matters. Governments have jurisdictions. Public programs have budgets. There are legitimate political questions about what governments owe citizens, legal residents, undocumented immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, any other group that may be marginalized. I'm not pretending those distinctions don't exist. I'm asking where they should matter. Because hunger doesn't check immigration status. A child's body doesn't require fewer calories because their parents crossed a border without authorization. So if two children have the same need, but one qualifies for assistance and the other doesn't, because of a legal classification, we are no longer measuring whether the need exists. We're measuring something else. Maybe we believe that something else should matter. Fine, then say that. That's the conversation I want us to have, not whether the child is hungry. We already know that. The political question is whether there are circumstances where something other than need should determine our response to it. And before we get too comfortable talking about who deserves help, let's flip this entire conversation around. Because deservingness doesn't only determine what we think people should receive. It also determines what we think people should endure. Who deserves punishment? Think about how much information we want before answering that question. What did they do? Why did they do it? Did they intend to do it? Were they under pressure? Have they done it before? Do they understand the harm they caused? Are they sorry? Can they change? Wait a minute. Haven't we been here before? Cause, circumstances, responsibility, character, deservingness. The same society deciding whether someone deserves assistance is also deciding whether someone deserves punishment. And suddenly, attribution theory isn't just about why somebody needs groceries. It can help us understand the question we ask when deciding how responsible someone is for harm and what consequences should follow. Of course, responsibility matters in criminal justice. Intent, actions, consequences, accountability, all of that matters. But even punishment has its limits. A person can commit a crime and still have constitutional rights. A person can hurt someone and still be entitled to due process. A person can deserve consequences without deserving every possible consequence we could inflict on them. That matters. Because somewhere in American politics, we have to be capable of holding two thoughts at the same time. People can be responsible for their choices, and people can still have needs. Those ideas do not cancel each other out. Someone can make terrible financial decisions and still be hungry. Someone can struggle with addiction after making choices that contributed to it and still need medical care. Someone can commit a crime and still be a human being. Responsibility can help us determine what kind of response makes sense. It doesn't have to determine whether we respond at all. And this is where I keep coming back to what my mother taught me. Baby, what you give a person is not for you to dictate. You've done your part. What they do with it is between them and God. Now, obviously, I understand that government cannot operate exactly like my mother. I mean, no one can. She's freaking amazing. Imagine Congress passing the Between You and God Act. Honestly, at this point, don't give them any ideas. But the principle underneath what she taught me still matters. She was teaching me that I didn't have to conduct an investigation into someone's worth before recognizing their need. But the government does have to investigate. The government does have to establish rules and decide how public resources are distributed. But there's a difference between determining eligibility and determining humanity. And maybe that's the line we keep losing. Because need is something we can measure. Income, hunger, housing instability, employment, health outcomes. Those can all be measured easily. Deservingness is different. Deservingness requires us to make a judgment. And sometimes that judgment may be relevant. Responsibility matters, contribution can matter, circumstances can matter. But we should at least recognize when we've stopped asking, what does this person need? And started asking, what kind of person do I think they are? Because those are two very different questions. And when we confuse them, policy can stop responding to the problem in front of us and start responding to the person we've decided deserves it. So after all this, I have one last question. Who deserves what? And maybe your answer hasn't changed. Maybe you still believe people should be held responsible for their choices. Maybe you believe government assistance should have limits. Fair. Maybe you believe citizenship matters, work matters, contributions matter, accountability matters. None of that requires you to stop being human. Because I don't think the hardest test of empathy is whether we can care about somebody who did everything right. That's easy. The harder test comes when somebody didn't. When they made the mistake. When they wasted the opportunity. When they knew better. When they don't look like the victim we pictured in our head. When their politics are different from ours. When their story makes us angry. When part of us wants to say, well, what did you expect? That's when we find out how conditional our empathy really is. And maybe you're thinking, hey Jay, there have to be consequences. I agree with you. But consequences and suffering aren't synonyms. Accountability and abandonment aren't synonyms. And compassion doesn't require us to pretend somebody did nothing wrong. Sometimes compassion is simply refusing to believe that a person's worst decision erased everything great about them. Because here's the uncomfortable part. Most of us are walking around with some version of ourselves that the world never had to meet. A decision that could have ended differently. A night we shouldn't have driven. A bill somebody helped us pay. A family member who let us come home. A mistake nobody found out about. A second chance we didn't technically earn. A person who loved us while we were still getting our shit together. Maybe you worked incredibly hard for everything you have. But somewhere along the way, somebody probably gave you something you couldn't give yourself. Time, patience, information, forgiveness, an opportunity, grace, or my favorite, the benefit of the doubt. And I wonder how many of us would pass the same deservingness test we quietly give everyone else if the worst parts of our own story were sitting on the table. That's why I come back to that hungry child. Most of us would feed that child. But why? Because they're innocent? Because they didn't cause the hunger? Because children can't be expected to provide for themselves. Okay. What happens when that child grows up? At what age does hunger become something you have to deserve relief from? When does the person standing in front of us stop being somebody's child and start becoming a collection of choices we feel entitled to judge? I don't have a perfect answer for that. And I don't think I'm supposed to. It's kind of the point. Because this episode was never really about deciding who deserves everything. It was about examining what happens inside us before we decide someone deserves anything. So yeah, maybe responsibility and contribution and circumstances matter. Maybe there are moments when all of those things should influence policy. But before we allow deservingness to determine our response to suffering, we should at least be willing to ask ourselves why deservingness matters to that particular need. Are we solving the problem, or are we punishing the person? Are we measuring responsibility or character? Are we protecting limited resources, or protecting ourselves from the uncomfortable possibility that sometimes terrible things happen to people who didn't earn them? Here's the question I really want you to take with you. When you decide someone doesn't deserve your empathy, what will you need to learn about them to change your mind? And if the answer is nothing, then maybe it was never their story you were judging. Maybe it was the prototype in your head. Because compassion doesn't always need a character reference. Sometimes somebody's hungry or sick or scared or addicted. Sometimes somebody just needs another chance. And sometimes that somebody is us. That's the connection I don't want us to lose. There isn't an us over here making good choices and a them over there making bad choices. There's just people. Complicated, inconsistent, emotional, imperfect people trying to make decisions with the information, circumstances, opportunities, wounds, advantages and disadvantages, and choices we've accumulated along the way. Understanding that doesn't require us to abandon accountability. It requires us to remember humanity while we're practicing it. So the next time you hear yourself asking, do they deserve it? Don't stop asking the question. Ask one more. Why does that matter here? Then check your answer. Check your assumptions. Check the history that shaped them. Check the story you've been told about the person standing in front of you. And most importantly, check whether you would use the same standard if that person were you. That's what we do here. We don't come here to be told what to think. We come here to investigate why we think it. We read the fine print. We check the receipts. And we investigate the asterisk. Because knowing better isn't always about having the right answer. It's being curious enough to question the one that came easiest. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. And this is You Oughta Know Betta. Stay curious. Stay human. Know better. Do better. Be better. I'll see you next time. Good night.